She walked into that corral in a wedding dress soaked through with sweat and desperation, and the most dangerous horse in Dry Mercy, Arizona, went completely still the moment her trembling hand touched the air between them. Nobody in that town had ever seen anything like it. Not the blacksmith, not the sheriff, not a single soul who'd been standing there waiting to watch a woman get trampled. If this kind of story moves something deep inside you, subscribe to this channel, follow every part to the very end, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Grace Whitaker did not walk into Dry Mercy, Arizona on the morning of July 14, 1883. She dragged herself in. One shoe was missing. The heel of the other had snapped clean off somewhere on the flat desert road between Tucson and nowhere. Her wedding dress, cream silk, hand-stitched along the collar, the kind of dress a father orders when he wants to prove he still has something to offer, had been white that morning. It wasn't white anymore. The hem was torn to mid-calf. The left sleeve hung by a single thread at the shoulder seam. Dust had worked its way into the fabric so completely that the dress had turned the same pale brown as the Arizona earth beneath her feet. She had been walking for 4 hours. She didn't stop when she reached the edge of town. She didn't slow down to look at the faces turning toward her from the boardwalk, from the doorways, from the open mouth of the general store, where 2 men stood with their thumbs hooked in their suspenders, and their eyes tracking her the way men track something they don't understand and aren't sure they want to. She kept walking because stopping felt like surrender, and Grace Whitaker had already surrendered everything else that morning. She wasn't going to give them that too. "Lord Almighty," a woman's voice said from somewhere to her left. Is she wearing a wedding dress? Looks like somebody's bride decided she had somewhere better to be." A man said, and laughed. Grace didn't look at him. She had stopped looking at people who laughed at her around the time her father had handed Victor Albright a handshake and a debt ledger and called it a marriage negotiation. What she was looking for was water, or shade, or something that resembled either one. What she found instead was the sound of a horse screaming. It came from the far end of the main road, a sound so raw and furious it cut straight through the heat and the noise of the town and landed somewhere behind Grace's sternum, like a fist. Not a whinny, not a snort. A full raging scream from an animal that had run out of patience with the entire human race, and Grace understood that feeling so completely in that moment that she turned toward the sound without thinking. The corral sat at the edge of town where the main road dissolved into open desert. It was a working operation. 3 connected paddocks, a tack shed, a small stable with a low roof, and a round training pen built from thick mesquite posts sunk deep into the hard ground. The fence of that round pen was shaking. Inside it, a black stallion the size of a war monument was doing everything in his power to destroy the world. He was the most beautiful and most terrifying thing Grace had ever seen. Solid black from ears to hooves, no markings, no white anywhere, coat sheened dark with sweat and effort. He moved like something that had never in its life been asked to hold still, spinning and striking and throwing his hindquarters at the fence with a sound like a rifle shot every time wood met wood. 3 separate lengths of rope trailed from his neck where handlers had tried and failed to get a hold. 2 of those ropes were already snapped. The third was fraying. Around the outside of the pen stood roughly a dozen men, some sitting on the top fence rail, some standing back with their arms crossed. They were watching with the specific, relaxed attention of people who expect someone else to get hurt and have decided to enjoy the show. In the center of the pen alone stood the blacksmith. Grace didn't know his name yet. What she saw was a man who had clearly been at this for a while. Shirt dark with sweat hat. Gone dark, hair damp against his forehead. A coil of rope in one hand that he was holding with enormous deliberate patience while the stallion screamed and spun 20 feet away. He wasn't chasing the horse. He wasn't trying to force him into a corner. He was just standing there, turning slowly on the spot to keep his face toward the animal waiting. It wasn't working. Every time the man took a slow half-step forward, the stallion erupted again, spinning, striking, slamming the fence. The watching men laughed at the fence posts shaking. One of them called out something Grace didn't catch, but she caught the tone. The kind of tone men use when they're watching something fail and finding it satisfying. "Midnight's gonna put Caleb on his back before noon," someone said behind her. "Already put 3 men in the doctor's office," said another voice. "Broke Jim Carrey's wrist clean through. Told Harlan he ought to just shoot the animal and be done with it. Horse like that ain't good for nothing but trouble." Grace had stopped walking. She wasn't sure when that had happened. She was standing at the outer fence of the round pen, now her broken shoe grinding into the dirt, her hands wrapped around a fence post, watching the man in the center of that ring try to reach something that didn't want to be reached. And watching the horse shake and scream and slam itself against the wood, and she thought with a clarity that surprised her, "He's not angry. He's terrified." People looked at that horse and saw a killer. She looked at that horse and saw something that had been pushed too far too many times by too many hands that meant to control instead of understand, and had reached the point where it could no longer tell the difference between danger and everything else. She knew what that felt like. Grace Whitaker put her hand on the top fence rail and climbed over. The reaction behind her was immediate. "Hey! What in the—" "Ma'am, you cannot go in there." The man in the center of the ring. Caleb, someone had called him, spun around at the commotion, and his face did something complicated when he saw her. Shock first, then something harder and more urgent. "Get out," he said, not loudly, but with a force that was clearly accustomed to being listened to. "Get out of this pen right now." "I'm not going to hurt him," Grace said. "He's going to hurt you." Caleb took a step toward her arm, out trying to angle himself between her and the stallion. "Ma'am, I am serious. This horse has put men twice your size in the dirt you need to—" "He's scared," Grace said. Caleb stopped. The stallion had gone still too. Not calm, not settled, but still in the way that terrified things go still when something unexpected happens. His ears were forward, his nostrils were working. He was staring at Grace with both eyes, which meant he had turned his whole body to face her, and she could see his sides heaving. "He's not mean," Grace said, and she wasn't talking to Caleb anymore. She was talking to the horse. Her voice had gone soft, the way voices do when they drop below the register of fear into something older and quieter. "You're not mean. You're just done being handled by people who don't listen." She raised one hand, palm out. Not reaching, not grabbing, just offering. The way you offer something to a person who has every reason to refuse. The stallion snorted, his hindquarters bunched. For 1 second it looked like he was going to spin again, and Grace was going to end up under 4 iron hooves, and that would be the end of the runaway bride from Tucson. Then he didn't. He stood there, sides heaving, and stared at her hand, and Grace Whitaker stood in the middle of that pen in her ruined wedding dress with her arm outstretched and waited. "You're all right," she said quietly. "Nobody's going to make you do anything. I'm just standing here, that's all." She heard nothing from outside the fence. Not a single voice. The men who had been laughing a minute ago had stopped. She could feel the weight of all that silence pressing in around her, but she didn't look away from the horse. She kept her eyes soft and her hands steady, and her body as still as she could manage, when her own legs were shaking from 4 hours of walking across desert hardpan. The stallion took 1 step toward her. Caleb didn't move, didn't breathe. The horse took another step, then another, and then his nose was 6 inches from Grace's palm, and she felt the heat of him, and the dampness of his breath, and the enormous vibrating tension of an animal that was choosing against every recent piece of evidence to extend something like trust to a stranger in a wedding dress, and then his nose touched her hand. Behind her, somebody let out a long, slow breath that sounded like it had been held for 10 minutes. Grace kept her hand steady and let him smell her, and didn't move until he lowered his head. Not all the way, not submission, but down like a sigh, like something releasing, and she slowly placed her palm against the side of his neck, and felt the muscles there jump once, and then quiet. "Good," she said. "Good boy. That's enough." She stayed there for a long moment. The stallion's breathing slowed. Then she took her hand back and turned around. Caleb Mercer was standing 8 feet away, the coil of rope slack in his hand, and he was looking at her the way people look at things they don't have a category for. He was maybe 34 strong through the shoulders, with the kind of hands that came from real work, rather than the idea of it, and dark eyes that were usually closed off. She'd learn later that usually gave nothing away. Right now, they weren't closed off at all. He looked like a man who had just watched something happen that rearranged several things he'd believed to be true. She became suddenly acutely aware of what she was wearing. She watched him take in the torn dress, the missing shoe, the hair falling loose from what had been 6 hours ago a carefully pinned bridal arrangement. She watched him look at her hands and see that they were shaking. She watched him look at her face and read something in it that she hadn't meant to leave visible. "Who are you running from?" he said. "Not where are you going? Not what happened to you. Not what in the world are you doing in my training pen. Just straight to the thing." Like a man who'd had enough experience with people fleeing to know that was always the real question, Grace considered lying. She was very tired of lying. She had been lying for 8 months, lying to herself mostly about what the arrangement with Victor Albright was about, whether her father had understood what he was trading her into, about whether there was still a way to make it all work without destroying anyone. She was done lying. "His name is Victor Albright," she said. "He's a railroad investor out of Philadelphia, and he believes he has a legal right to everything that is standing in front of you right now." She paused. "He's wrong, but he has papers that say otherwise, and in about 4 hours, he's going to have men at every road into this territory looking for me." Caleb said nothing for a moment. He looked at her. Then he looked at Midnight, who was standing docile and quiet now at the center of the pen, watching them both with an expression that would have read on a human face as mild curiosity. "You calm my most unmanageable horse in under 5 minutes, Caleb said slowly. "And then you tell me you've got a railroad man with a legal claim chasing you down the Tucson road." He let that sit in the air between them. "That about the shape of it?" "That's the shape of it," Grace said. Caleb turned the coil of rope over in his hands once. "I reckon," he said, "you'd better come out of this pen before someone decides to make a story out of it. More of a story than they're already making." He walked toward the gate without waiting to see if she followed, but he held it open. Grace Whitaker walked out of that round pen and into Caleb Mercer's corral, and into whatever was going to happen next, and she kept her back straight and her chin up because she had learned a long time ago that the moment you let them see you fold, they took it as permission to finish the job. Behind her, Midnight stood quiet and watched her go, and in the crowd of men along the outer fence, not one of them laughed. Martha Bell was watching from the doorway of the Dry Mercy boarding house, 30 yards up the road, arms folded, expression unreadable, when the girl in the ruined wedding dress came out of Caleb Mercer's training pen and stood in the heat of the July noon, without flinching under the stares of half the town. Martha had run the boarding house for 11 years. She had seen every kind of woman pass through Dry Mercy miners' wives' saloon girls, school teachers' mail-order brides who'd taken one look at what the West actually was and caught the next eastbound stage. She had strong opinions about all of them, and she expressed those opinions in the form of room rates. What she was looking at now didn't fit any category she owned. The girl wasn't crying, wasn't shaking or not visibly. She was standing in a dress that had been worth more money than most of the men in this town would see in a month, now torn and filthy beyond recovery, and she was holding herself like the dress was made of armor rather than ruined silk. Martha unfolded her arms, refolded them, made a decision that she would spend the next several months second-guessing and then eventually deciding was one of the 3 or 4 best she'd ever made. She walked across the road. "You need water," she said, arriving in front of the girl. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am," the girl said. She looked at Martha with dark eyes that were exhausted and clear at the same time, and said, "I don't have any money." "I didn't ask you if you had money," Martha said. "I said you need water." She looked at the torn sleeve, the broken shoe, the state of the girl's feet where the heel blister had opened up and started to bleed through what remained of her stocking. "You're bleeding," she said. "I know." "Does Caleb Mercer know you're about to fall over?" Something crossed the girl's face, not pride, but the cousin of it. "I'm not going to fall over," she said. Martha said, which meant several things at once, none of them spoken. She looked over her shoulder at Caleb, who had emerged from the round pen, and was now standing at the gatepost, watching them with the particular careful stillness of a man who had learned not to reach for things directly, but couldn't entirely stop himself from paying attention. He met Martha's eyes across the road. She gave him a look that said, "Don't be stupid." He gave her a look back that said, "I'm thinking about it." Martha turned back to the girl. "What's your name?" "Grace," she said. "Grace Whitaker." "Where are you from, Grace Whitaker?" "Tucson originally." A pause. "I was supposed to be getting married this morning." "I can see that." Martha looked at the dress one more time. "Didn't take." "No, ma'am, it didn't take." Martha Bell reached out and took Grace Whitaker by the elbow firmly, the way you take hold of someone who needs steadying but doesn't want to ask for it, and steered her toward the boarding house. "You'll drink some water," she said, "and sit down and tell me what kind of trouble is coming down that road after you, because whatever it is, it's going to be in my town, and I prefer to know about things before they arrive." Grace didn't argue. She walked. Behind them, Caleb Mercer watched until the boarding house door closed, and then he stood alone in the full hammer of the Arizona afternoon and looked at the open gate of his round pen, where his most dangerous horse stood quiet as a Sunday morning. He coiled the rope in his hands, uncoiled it, coiled it again. "Well," he said to no one in particular, in the particular tone of a man who has just realized that the next several weeks of his life are going to be substantially more complicated than he'd planned for. Inside the pen, Midnight tossed his head once and went back to standing still. Martha Bell did not do things halfway. By the time Grace had finished the first cup of water and started on the second, Martha had already sent the boy who swept her front porch running to the dry goods store for a pair of women's boots in a size she estimated by looking at Grace's feet for approximately 4 seconds. She had also produced a clean work shirt, a dark brown skirt that had belonged to a woman who'd left owing 3 weeks of room and board and never come back, and a basin of cool water with a cloth for the blisters. Grace sat at the small table in Martha's back kitchen and let herself be managed. It was a strange feeling. For 8 months, every person who had tried to manage her had been doing it in service of handing her over to Victor Albright. Martha Bell was doing it because she was the kind of woman who responded to problems by solving them, and apparently Grace's immediate physical condition qualified as a problem worth solving. "Eat," Martha said, setting a plate of cold cornbread on the table. Grace ate. "Now," Martha said, pulling out the chair across from her and sitting down with the deliberate weight of a woman who had been on her feet since before sunrise and intended to have a conversation whether the other party was ready or not. "Tell me about the man with the papers." So Grace told her. She kept it short because the facts were not complicated, only ugly. Victor Albright had come to Tucson 8 months ago as a representative of the Southern Arizona Railroad Consortium, which was buying land rights across the territory and needed local investors and local goodwill to smooth the process. Grace's father, Edmund Whitaker, had been neither an investor nor particularly goodwill producing, but he had owned 300 acres of flat, dry land, sitting directly in the path of a proposed rail line, and he had owed a great deal of money to a bank that Victor Albright happened to be on friendly terms with. The arrangement had been simple, as arrangements made over other people's lives tend to be. Edmund Whitaker's debts would be absorbed by the consortium. The land would transfer. And his daughter, 24 unmarried, reportedly capable of managing a household, and possessed of a small inheritance from her mother's family that would legally pass to her husband upon marriage, would become Mrs. Victor Albright. Nobody had asked Grace. When she had objected, her father had looked at her with the specific exhausted expression of a man who had run out of options and was frustrated that the people affected by his decisions kept pointing it out. "You'll be taken care of," he'd said, as if being taken care of was the same thing as being allowed to live. The wedding had been set for July 14th. Grace had spent 7 of the 8 months looking for a way out and finding none. The law in Arizona Territory in 1883 was not particularly interested in whether a woman had consented to her own financial transfer. What Victor had was legal. What Grace had was her own 2 feet and the hour before dawn. She had taken both and run. Martha listened to all of this without interrupting, which Grace suspected was not Martha's natural mode, but which she was deploying out of strategic patience. When Grace finished, Martha sat quietly for a moment and then said, "How long before he figures out you came through here?" 4 hours, Grace said. "Maybe 5. There was only one road north from where I left the stagecoach, and the driver knew I'd gotten off at the Dry Mercy junction." She paused. "I didn't try to hide. I didn't have anywhere to go. I just needed to move." "You needed to not be there," Martha said. "Yes." Martha looked at her for a long moment. "You've got 2 options as I see it," she said. "You leave again before he arrives, in which case you're back on foot in July heat with nowhere to go, and he finds you within a day because you're not hard to track and you're not in any condition to outrun anyone." She said this without cruelty, just precision. "Or you stay, and you find a way to make staying worth more to you than leaving. I can't ask anyone here to put themselves against Victor Albright," Grace said. "He has money and lawyers, and he will make trouble for anyone who—" "I didn't ask you what you could ask," Martha said. "I asked you which option made more sense." Grace was quiet. "There's a man at the end of this road," Martha said, "who runs a horse corral and pays his debts and minds his own business, and who watched you walk into a pen with a horse that broke Jim Carrey's wrist and stand there like you had nothing to fear from it." She picked up her coffee cup and studied it. "Caleb Mercer has not taken on a hired hand in 3 years, not since his wife died. He's managed alone, which means he's been managing poorly, which I have told him directly on multiple occasions." She set the cup down. "I am not suggesting anything romantic. I am suggesting employment." Grace looked at her hands. At the calluses already there from the months she'd spent during her engagement trying to occupy herself with anything that didn't make her feel like a piece of furniture being moved from one room to another. She'd learned to handle horses during that time. The stable boy at the Tucson Hotel, where Victor had housed her family, had been sympathetic and young and had taught her everything he knew in exchange for someone to talk to. "I'm not afraid of work," Grace said. "Good," Martha said, "because Caleb Mercer's version of work is not the gentle kind." She stood up, picked up Grace's empty plate and said, "Change your dress and do something about your hair. Not because it matters to me, but because when you walk out of here, you're going to walk past every person in this town who just watched you do something they can't explain, and how you carry yourself in the next 10 minutes will determine how they talk about you for the next 10 years. Grace looked at her. "This is a small town," Martha said. "First impressions are currency. You just spent a considerable amount of it on a horse. Don't waste it now." Grace stood up and changed her dress. She walked out of Martha's boarding house 20 minutes later in borrowed clothes that fit well enough boots that were half a size too large but infinitely better than what she'd arrived in, and with her hair pinned back with a simple knot that was not elegant but was deliberate, which she had learned was more important. She walked straight down the center of the main road, and the people on the boardwalk watched her, and she looked straight ahead. At the corral gate, Caleb Mercer was mending a section of fence that midnight had damaged during the morning's argument. He heard her coming. Her footsteps were uneven in the oversized boots, and he looked up. He took in the changed clothes, the hair, the straightened posture all in one glance, and then he went back to the fence. "Martha send you," he said. "Martha suggested," Grace said. "I decided." He set the hammer down and turned around. "I can offer you work in a room above the tack shed. It's not comfortable, but it's solid, and there's a lock on the door." He said this the way he said most things she'd come to realize directly and without decoration. "I can't pay wages for the first month. After that, if you're still here and you've earned it, we can talk about wages." "What's the work?" "Stalls need cleaning twice a day. Horses need feeding at dawn and dusk. Water troughs need checking morning and afternoon. Tack needs oiling, harness needs checking, and I've got a mare in the third paddock who's going to foal in the next 2 weeks and needs someone keeping an eye on her overnight." He paused. "And midnight needs working, every day. I've been trying to get him to the point where someone can ride him for 4 months, and I'm clearly missing something." He said that last part without embarrassment, which she respected. "When do I start?" she said. "You already have," he said, picked up his hammer and went back to the fence. That was how Grace Whitaker came to live at the edge of Dry Mercy, Arizona, in a small room above a tack shed that smelled like leather and hay and old wood, with a lock on the door that actually worked in the hottest summer the territory had seen in 11 years. The first morning she was at the stable before sunrise, and the horses already knew her, because animals remember people who have handled them without fear, and she moved through the stalls with the quiet efficiency of someone who has found the particular relief of having a task that is entirely concrete. Scoop, lift, carry, fill. It required everything her body had and nothing her mind couldn't spare. And for the first time in 8 months, Grace Whitaker spent 4 hours without thinking about Victor Albright once. Caleb appeared at the stable door just as she was finishing. The last stall took one look at the completed work, said, "You missed a corner in the second one," and walked away. Grace went back and cleaned the corner. The second morning, she finished 30 minutes faster and missed nothing. Caleb didn't comment. But when she came out of the stable, there was a cup of coffee sitting on the fence post nearest the door, still hot, which meant he'd timed it. She drank it without saying anything. He was on the far side of the corral working with a young gelding and didn't look over. But she noticed he hadn't made coffee for himself until after she'd picked up the cup. Small things. She was learning to read him in small things because small things were all he offered. The mare foaled on the 5th night. Grace had been checking her every 2 hours and was there when it started, and she went to get Caleb because the foal was positioned wrong, and she knew enough to know she didn't know enough. He came immediately. She'd knocked on the small house at the edge of the property at 2 in the morning, and he'd answered the door already half-dressed, which told her he'd been awake. And they spent 4 hours working together in the low lantern light of the stable, not talking much, adjusting and waiting and correcting. And when the foal finally arrived and got its legs under it, and its mother turned to clean it, Caleb sat back on his heels and let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere very deep. "Good call coming to get me," he said. "I knew it was beyond me," Grace said. "Most people don't know what's beyond them," he said. "That's how you lose horses." He looked at her then, in the low light, with the foal unsteady and new behind them, and the whole quiet weight of 4 hours of difficult work sitting between them and Grace, looked back, and it was one of those moments that doesn't announce itself, but that both people remember later with great precision. Then he stood up, said, "Get some sleep," and walked back to his house. Grace stayed with the mare and the foal until sunrise because she wasn't tired anymore, and because the tack room felt smaller than it usually did. Victor Albright arrived in Dry Mercy on the 6th day. She saw the dust from the road before she saw him, a hired buggy moving faster than the road warranted, which told her everything about his state of mind. She was in the round pen with midnight when it appeared on the horizon, and she felt the familiar cold weight settle into her stomach, the one that lived just below her ribs and had been her constant companion for 8 months. Midnight felt it too. He moved closer to her, not dramatically, just a step of repositioning so that he was standing at her shoulder instead of across the pen. "I know," she said quietly. She didn't run. Running was what had gotten her this far, and it wasn't going to get her any further. She had made a decision the night the foal was born, lying awake in the tack room, listening to the sounds of the stable, that she was done moving away from things. She needed to start moving towards something. She wasn't entirely sure what yet, but she was staying in this pen until she decided. Caleb came out of the stable when the buggy pulled up at the corral gate. He'd heard it too. He positioned himself between the gate and the round pen without making a production of it, which Grace noticed. Victor Albright stepped out of the buggy like a man arriving at a business meeting, which to him was exactly what this was. He was dressed for Tucson, not the Arizona desert, and the effect of 40 miles in a hired buggy on his polished exterior was visible in the precise ways a man like Victor most hated: the sweat on his collar, the dust on his boots, the hair slightly wrong. He smoothed his jacket as he stepped down, and looked around the corral with the specific expression of someone who believes that looking at things directly gives you ownership of them. He found Grace immediately. People like Victor always did. They had a particular radar for the things they believed belonged to them. Grace, he said. And the way he said her name was the way you say a fact rather than a person's name. Flat, certain. A thing he was identifying. Mr. Albright, Grace said from inside the round pen. She didn't move toward the gate. Victor's eyes moved to Caleb standing between them and took a precise measurement of him. "I'm here for my fiancée," he said. "I don't believe we've met. Victor Albright, Southern Arizona Railroad Consortium." "Caleb Mercer," Caleb said. "This is my property." "Indeed." Victor smiled pleasantly the way men smile when they want to establish that pleasantness is a choice rather than a requirement. "Then I appreciate your hospitality in giving her a place to recover. She's had a difficult few days, I'm sure you understand. She suffers from periods of confusion that can lead her to make impulsive decisions." He reached into his jacket and produced a folded document. "I have a legal contract establishing our arrangement. If you could just open the gate, I'll take her off your hands and we won't trouble you further." Caleb did not take the document. He did not look at it. He kept his eyes on Victor's face. "She told me she doesn't want to go with you." "With respect," Victor said, still pleasant. "What she wants isn't legally relevant. This contract was signed by her father, and—" "She's a grown woman," Caleb said. "Not a piece of property listed in a contract." The pleasantness left Victor's face. Not all at once, it drained slowly, which was more unsettling than if it had vanished quickly. What was underneath it was not anger. It was something colder and more considered. "I'd be careful about the position you're taking here, Mr. Mercer," he said quietly. "I have significant relationships with the territorial authorities. A man in your position working with limited capital dependent on local goodwill, it would be a shame if certain questions were raised about your operation." Caleb looked at him for a long moment. "Are you threatening me?" "I'm making an observation," Victor said, "about how the world works." Behind Caleb, Grace had come to the gate of the round pen. Midnight stood directly behind her, still watching. "Victor," she said. He turned his head toward her with the particular controlled motion of a man exercising patience. "Grace, this would go much more smoothly if you—" "I'm not confused," she said. "I'm not suffering from anything. I left because I chose to leave, and I'm staying here because I choose to stay." She kept her voice level. She had rehearsed the next part in the tack room on the second night, going over it until the words felt like her own rather than borrowed. "The arrangement with my father was made without my knowledge or consent. I was not a party to it. And whatever that contract says, it cannot compel a person against their will." Actually, Victor said, in the territory of Arizona, in the year 1883, it rather can. The silence that followed that statement was the kind that contained the entire weight of everything wrong with the world, distilled into one sentence. Caleb turned his head to look at Grace. Their eyes met through the gate bars. He didn't say anything. What passed across his face was not pity, she would have closed off immediately against pity, but something more like fury, held very carefully in check. "I have no intention of settling this on a dusty road," Victor said, smoothing his jacket again. "I'll be at the Dry Mercy Hotel tonight. I expect you to come to your senses by morning, Grace. If not—" He looked at Caleb. "I'll handle it through proper legal channels, which will involve the sheriff." He tucked the document back into his jacket. "Good day, Mr. Mercer." He got back into the buggy. The driver turned it around. The dust came back up and then settled again, and the road was empty. Caleb stood at the gate for a long moment after the buggy disappeared. Then he said without turning around, "How much of what he said is accurate about the contract?" "Most of it," Grace said quietly. "The law is on his side. The facts are on mine. They're not always the same thing." Caleb turned around then. He looked at Midnight standing steady at Grace's back, and then at Grace, and then he said very carefully, as if choosing each word by weight, "I need you to tell me everything you know about that man. Everything you heard him say when you were with him. Every conversation you weren't supposed to be part of. He paused. Because a man who threatens a horse handler in front of witnesses is not a man who's operating from a position of strength. He's operating from one of fear, and scared men make mistakes. Another pause. I need to know what his mistakes are before tomorrow morning. Grace looked at him for a long moment. Then she pushed the pen gate open and walked through it and sat down on the fence rail because she'd been standing in July heat for 6 hours and her legs had earned a rest, and she said, "Then you'd better sit down." Caleb sat on the rail beside her, not close but close enough that their voices didn't need to carry, and she started from the beginning, not the personal part, not the part about her father's face. When he'd looked at her, she couldn't do that part yet, but the practical part, the business part, the conversations she'd overheard in hotel lobbies, and through doors that hadn't been completely closed, because Victor Albright was a man who talked freely in front of people he considered beneath his notice, and Grace had spent 8 months making herself as unnoticeable as possible. She told him about the insurance claims, about the land surveys that didn't match the ones filed with the consortium, about the name that appeared in 3 separate conversations that she hadn't understood at the time, and had written on the back of a calling card in her dress pocket, and still had, because she'd tucked it inside her corset when she ran, and it had come through 4 hours of desert walking intact. She pulled it out. A small white card, bent and sweat-stained. On the back, in her own careful handwriting, was a name and 2 numbers that she'd transcribed from memory after hearing them spoken through a hotel room door. Caleb looked at it. She watched something happen in his eyes, a recognition, a calculation, the pieces of something clicking together. "This name," he said. "Thomas Birch. You're sure about this name?" "I wrote it down that night," Grace said. "I'm sure." "Thomas Birch is the territorial land assessor," Caleb said slowly. "He's the man who verifies survey claims before they go to the federal office." He looked at her. "If Victor Albright has Thomas Birch, he can file surveys that say anything he wants, and they'll come back verified. He can take land that was never legally offered, document it as sold, and no one at the federal level would question the numbers." "That's what I thought it meant," Grace said. "I didn't know enough to be certain. How many names do you have?" She pulled the card back and looked at the other side. Her own name, the hotel name, a Tucson address in Victor's handwriting from when he'd given it to her as a calling card 2 months ago. "Birch is the only official name," she said. "But there are 2 amounts. I don't know what they're payments for, but they're large." Caleb stared at the card for a long moment, without saying anything. Midnight had come to the fence behind them and was standing with his chin resting on the top rail between their shoulders, which Caleb appeared not to have noticed, or had decided to pretend not to notice. "He's not going to leave in the morning," Grace said. "I want to be honest about that. He doesn't leave things. When he says he'll handle it through proper channels, he means it. He will go to the sheriff with the contract, and the sheriff will have to take it seriously, regardless of what he thinks about it personally." "I know," Caleb said. "I'm telling you so you can make a decision about whether this is worth what it's going to cost you," Grace said. She said it without looking at him because she needed to be able to say it all the way through. "I have no right to ask you to put your livelihood in front of his lawyers. I came here on my own, and I calmed your horse, and I've been doing the work, and I'm grateful for all of it, but I'm not asking you to fight my fight for me. That's not why I told you about the card." Caleb was quiet for long enough that she looked over. He was looking straight ahead. Jaw set a particular stillness in his body that she'd started to recognize as the thing that happened right before he made a decision. "3 years ago," he said, "my wife got sick. We didn't know what it was at first: fever, then worse. There was a doctor in Tucson who had medicine that could have helped, and the man who ran the stage line out of Dry Mercy decided he didn't want to carry it because it cut into the space he needed for goods from his contract with the consortium." He paused. The consortium's regional manager at the time was a man named Albright. Grace turned to look at him fully. "Different Albright," Caleb said, his voice flat. "His brother. They run the operation together, the railroad men." He paused again. "Eleanor died in February of 1880. She was 29. The heat pressed down around them. Somewhere in the stable, a horse shifted and blew. Midnight lifted his chin from the rail and stood back one step. "Caleb," Grace said, and stopped because there was nothing adequate to say. "I'm not going to fight your fight for you," Caleb said. "That's not what I'm doing." He stood up from the fence rail and looked down at her. "I'm going to fight a man who thinks he can come onto my property and threaten me and take a woman who doesn't want to be taken and who happens to have a brother whose decisions killed my wife." He picked up the small card, looked at it one more time, and placed it carefully in his shirt pocket. "In the morning before Victor Albright visits the sheriff, I'm going to visit someone first." He walked back toward the stable. Grace sat on the fence rail in the July heat with Midnight standing behind her. The horse's breath warm and steady at the back of her neck, and she thought about the particular way the world worked. Sometimes, how running from one thing could carry you directly toward the thing that the running was always supposed to be for. And she thought about a woman named Eleanor, who had died in February, and a man who had spent 3 years building walls around everything he felt. She thought about what it meant when someone with walls like that opened a gate. Midnight bumped her shoulder with his nose very gently, the way he had started to do in the past 3 days when he wanted her attention. "All right," she said. "I hear you." She climbed back into the pen. She worked with him until the light was entirely gone, and neither of them needed to be told to stay. Caleb left before sunrise. Grace heard him go, the particular sound of his boots on the packed earth outside the creak of the stable gate, the sound of a horse being saddled with quiet efficiency. She lay in the tack room with her eyes open and the small card's absence from her pocket like a physical thing, and she listened to him ride out, and she made herself stay where she was, because she had learned enough about Caleb Mercer in 10 days to know that following him would be read as distrust, and distrust was the one thing he wouldn't forgive. She got up and fed the horses instead. Midnight ate from her hand now. He had started doing it on the 4th day, just dropped his head and took the grain directly from her palm with a delicacy that was completely at odds with everything he'd been before she arrived. Caleb had watched it happen from across the corral and said nothing, but she'd seen him turn away and do the specific thing he did with his jaw when something moved him that he didn't want to show. The town was quiet at that hour. Dry Mercy didn't fully wake until the sun had been up an hour, which meant Grace had 60 minutes before Victor Albright was likely to be moving. She used all of them. She was back inside the tack room when she heard the first sound from the road. Not a buggy this time. 2 horses moving at a walk. She opened the door and looked out and saw Caleb returning, and beside him on a gray mare, a man she didn't recognize. Older heavyset with a silver badge on his vest that caught the early light. The sheriff. Grace's stomach went cold. She stepped out of the tack room and stood in the corral yard and made herself visible because disappearing now would look like guilt, and guilt was Victor's argument, not hers. Caleb pulled up at the fence and looked at her with the steady expression he used when he needed her to trust him without explanation. "This is Sheriff Roy Deakins," he said. "Roy, this is Grace Whitaker." The sheriff looked at her the way lawmen look at people they're still forming an opinion about, careful, not unkind, but absolutely withholding. "Miss Whitaker," he said, "Mr. Mercer tells me you have some information about Victor Albright." "Yes, sir," Grace said. "He also tells me Albright threatened him yesterday on his own property." Deakins shifted in the saddle. "That I would have liked to see myself." He said it quietly, and something in his tone told Grace that the sheriff of Dry Mercy and the railroad investor had already had dealings that hadn't ended warmly. "Come down," Grace said. "I'll tell you everything." Deakins dismounted. Caleb did not come inside. He stayed at the gate with the horses, which Grace understood was his way of giving her the room and the credibility. This was her story. He was just the man who'd gotten her the audience. She told Deakins everything she'd told Caleb, and more. The second conversation she hadn't mentioned the night before, because she hadn't been sure of its relevance. A discussion between Victor and a man she'd never seen in the back room of a Tucson hotel about a land parcel listed under one owner's name, but assessed under another's. She'd memorized numbers because her mind worked that way, had always worked that way, cataloging details the way other people catalog faces, and she put them on the table for Deacons, the way you put cards down and let someone else read the hand. Deacons listened. He asked 3 questions. They were precise questions that told Grace he already knew more than he was showing, which meant the sheriff of Dry Mercy had been watching Victor Albright and lacked exactly the kind of specific documentation Grace was now providing. When she finished, Deacon sat back and looked at his hat in his hands. "Thomas Birch has been questioned twice in the past year," he said, "by the Federal Land Office. Both times he produced paperwork that cleared him. If your numbers match what the federal office has been looking for, that paperwork falls apart." "Then they should have my numbers," Grace said. "They will," Deacons said. He stood up. "Miss Whitaker, I want to be honest with you. What you have complicates Albright's position considerably, but it doesn't dissolve the contract your father signed. That's a civil matter, and it moves slower than a criminal investigation." He paused. "What it does is give me reason to delay any action on that contract until the federal matter is resolved, which could be weeks or months." Grace understood what he was telling her. "You're saying you can keep him from taking me today. I'm saying he came here with a contract, not a warrant," Deacon said. "And I'm saying that a man under federal investigation does not have the standing to enforce a civil contract through my office while that investigation is active." He put his hat back on. "I'm also saying that if Albright tries to move on you without my involvement, he's operating outside the law, and that's a different matter entirely." He walked back to his horse. At the gate he stopped and looked at Caleb. Something passed between them, the shorthand of men who have known each other a long time and trust each other exactly as far as experience has warranted, which in their case appeared to be fairly far. "You'll keep her here," Deacon said. "She keeps herself where she chooses," Caleb said. "But yes." Deacons nodded and rode back toward town. Caleb came into the corral yard and stopped a few feet from Grace and said, "He's going to Albright now, to tell him his contract is being reviewed pending a federal inquiry." "Victor won't accept that," Grace said immediately. "He'll want to know where the inquiry came from. He'll know it came from me." "Yes," Caleb said. "That makes things more dangerous, not less." "Yes," Caleb said again. He looked at her directly. "But it makes them more honest. And honest I can work with." Victor Albright came to the corral at 10 o'clock in the morning, and he did not come alone. He brought 2 men with him, the kind of men whose function was entirely communicated by the way they stood, slightly behind, and to either side, hands loose and visible. He had also shed the courtesy of the day before. Whatever Deacons had said to him at the hotel had burned through the last of his performance. He stopped at the corral fence and looked at Grace, who was in the round pen with Midnight, and his face was the face of a man who has been inconvenienced beyond his tolerance for it. "You spoke to the sheriff," he said. "I did," Grace said. "She didn't come out of the pen. You gave him fabricated information about my business dealings." "I gave him accurate information about your business dealings," Grace said. "The accuracy is the part that concerns you." Victor's jaw moved. "That card you're referencing, you stole that from my personal correspondence. Anything derived from it is inadmissible and you know it." "You gave it to me," Grace said. "It was your calling card. My handwriting on the back is my own notes which I'm entitled to share with anyone I choose." Caleb had come out of the stable and was standing at the fence line, not at the gate, positioned in the way he positioned himself, not blocking, not threatening, just present. Immovable, the way a fence post is immovable. It wasn't a posture he performed. It was simply what he was. Victor looked at him. The calculation in his eyes was visible and unpleasant. "Mr. Mercer," he said, "I want you to understand something clearly. I have friends in the territorial legislature. I have friends at the Federal Land Office. I have friends at every bank that holds a note on every property in a 50-mile radius." He let that sit. A man with a small horse operation and no political connections would be very unwise to make an enemy of me. "I reckon," Caleb said, "that depends on the cost of the alternative." "The alternative," Victor said, "is that you step back, this woman fulfills her legal obligation, and you go back to breaking horses in the desert without anyone paying you any particular attention." He spread his hands as if this were a generous offer. You don't want my attention, Mr. Mercer. I promise you that. Midnight moved to Grace's shoulder. She put her hand on his neck without looking down. I want to talk to Grace, Victor said, switching registers. The businessman voice dropped something more personal in its place, something almost intimate. Privately. That's all I'm asking. 5 minutes. No, Grace said. Grace, I said no. Her voice was steady. It surprised her how steady it was. There's nothing you're going to say to me in private that you can't say in front of these people, and there's nothing you could say in front of these people that would change my answer. So there is no version of 5 minutes that ends differently. Something moved through Victor's face that she'd only seen once before on the night she'd told him she didn't want to marry him 6 months ago in a hotel parlor with her father sitting 3 feet away not saying anything. She'd seen it then and not understood it. She understood it now. It wasn't anger. It was the specific bewilderment of a man who genuinely could not comprehend being refused, who had organized his entire understanding of the world around the premise that everything had a price, and was encountering for the first time something that wasn't for sale. It made him more dangerous, not less. Fine, he said, very quietly. Fine. He turned and walked back to the buggy. His 2 men followed. The buggy moved back up the road toward town. Caleb was beside her before the dust had settled. He's not done, he said. I know, Grace said. He's going to find a way to come at this that doesn't require the sheriff's involvement, Caleb said. Men like that, when the legal road gets complicated, they find a different road. Grace was watching the buggy disappear around the bend in the main road. He'll go after you, she said. Not me directly. He'll go after your operation. Your notes, your contracts, your supply lines. She turned to look at Caleb. I should leave. If I'm not here, he has no reason to. Don't, Caleb said. The word came out sharper than his usual register, and he seemed to hear it because he paused and came back to the level tone. Don't make decisions based on what he wants. That's how he controls people who aren't even in the room with him anymore. He looked at her. You've been making decisions based on Victor Albright's next move for 8 months. What would you do if you stopped? Grace stared at him. It was such a direct question that it required a direct answer, and she didn't have one immediately, which was itself an answer. I'd stay, she said finally. Then stay, Caleb said, and walked back toward the stable. 3 days passed, and nothing happened, which was worse than something happening. Waiting had a weight to it. Grace felt it in the way the town looked at her, the calculation in people's eyes when she came to Martha's for supplies, the way conversation stopped 1 beat too early when she passed. Dry Mercy was a small town with a long memory and a short attention span, and what it was paying attention to now was whether Victor Albright or Grace Whitaker was going to win, which was the wrong question. But small towns tended toward the wrong questions when they were bored enough. Martha told her this directly, which Grace appreciated. They're not against you, Martha said on the morning of the second day, setting coffee down in front of her with the specific emphasis she gave to things she wanted Grace to take seriously. They just haven't decided yet, and people who haven't decided are useless until they do. How do they decide? Grace said. Martha looked at her. They watched to see who flinches first. Grace didn't flinch. She went to the corral every morning and she worked and she ate the meals that appeared on the fence post when Caleb made too much of something and couldn't bring himself to say so directly. And she worked with Midnight every afternoon until the heat broke enough to breathe. And every evening she sat on the top fence rail and watched the road until it was too dark to see. On the 4th day, Caleb came out of the stable in the early afternoon and said, I need your help with something. She climbed down from the fence. He led her to the round pen where he stood in the center. No rope, no halter, just himself, and said, Show me what you do. She looked at him. What I do with Midnight. Show me how you approach him, from the beginning. She understood then. He wasn't asking for Midnight's sake. Midnight was already hers had been since the 2nd week. He was asking because he'd spent 4 months trying to reach that horse the way he'd been taught, and it hadn't worked. And he was finally willing to try the way someone else knew how. That was not a small thing for a man like Caleb. She understood exactly how large it was. "Stand still," she said, "and drop your shoulders." He dropped his shoulders. "Your hands. Open them." He opened his hands. "Don't look at him directly. Look just past him. Let him decide whether you're worth coming to." Caleb shifted his gaze. Midnight was on the far side of the panniers, forward watching. They stood there for a full 2 minutes, the three of them in the July heat, not moving. Grace watched the horse's posture change in increments, the tension going down through his neck, his weight shifting forward by degrees, the specific recalibration of an animal deciding something. Midnight walked to Caleb and put his nose against Caleb's open palm. Caleb didn't move. But she saw his throat move. She saw what that cost him to hold still against. "Now," she said very quietly, "close your hand. Not to hold, just to touch." He closed his hand gently against the stallion's nose. Midnight didn't pull back. They stood like that for a long moment. The man and the horse and Grace watched something happen in Caleb's body that she didn't have a word for. A releasing, the way a door opens that's been stuck a long time. Not dramatic, just suddenly no longer stuck. "How long have you known how to do this?" he said very quietly, not to break the moment. "I learned it from a stable boy in Tucson who was 17 years old and understood horses better than any man twice his age," Grace said. "He told me the secret is that you never try to take anything. You only ever offer." Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then, still not moving, still holding Midnight's nose in his open hand, he said, "Eleanor used to say something like that, about people." A pause. "I forgot it for a while." Grace didn't say anything. Sometimes the right response to something true was to let it be true without commentary. They were still standing there when they heard the sound from the road. Not a buggy this time. Hooves 4, maybe 6 horses moving fast. Too fast for normal travel. The sound of it had an urgency that registered in Grace's chest before her mind had finished identifying what she was hearing. Midnight's head came up. Caleb turned. 2 riders came hard through the main gate of the corral yard and pulled up so fast the horses sat back on their haunches. One of the men was young, maybe 19, one of the Harlan boys who worked the livery at the north end of town. He was breathing like he'd been running himself. "Caleb," he said. "Albright's at the bank." The cold weight returned to Grace's stomach. "Which bank?" Caleb said. It wasn't a question. "Mason's. He's been in there an hour." The Harlan boy looked between them. "My uncle works the floor. He said Albright came in with papers, said he has a lien claim on your supply contracts. Something about a debt instrument assigned from the consortium." He paused. Mr. Mason looked scared. Caleb's jaw set. He looked at Grace with the specific expression of a man recalibrating rapidly. "He's not coming at you," he said. "He's coming at me, to make you come to him." "I told you he would," Grace said. Her voice was steady, but her hands were not. She pressed them flat against her thighs. "He needs you to choose to come," Caleb said. "If he takes you by force with a federal inquiry pending, he creates a criminal problem for himself. So he's going to squeeze everything around you until the pressure makes you walk to him on your own. And if I don't..." Caleb looked at her directly. "Then he keeps squeezing." The Harlan boy and his companion were watching this exchange with the wide eyes of people who have delivered news they're no longer sure they should have delivered. "Go back to town," Caleb told them. "Both of you. Don't tell anyone you came here." They went. Caleb stood in the middle of the corral yard in the full weight of the July afternoon and did what he always did before a decision went still. Completely, deliberately still. Grace had stopped reading that stillness as absence. It was the opposite of absence. It was everything concentrated. "I'm going to the bank," he said. "It won't help," Grace said. "Whatever Albright filed, it's legal. You said it yourself, he knows how to use the system." "I know," Caleb said. "I'm not going to fight the paper. I'm going to tell Mason directly that Albright is under federal inquiry, and that any instrument he signed with a man under investigation carries its own legal risk." He paused. Mason's a cautious man. He won't want to be holding Albright's paper if it gets pulled into a federal proceeding. That could work, Grace said slowly. But if Albright finds out, he'll find out, Caleb said. That's the point. I want him to find out. He looked at her. I want him to know that every move he makes here is being met. Not with money because I don't have his money. With information, with people, with the fact that this town has known me for 12 years and known him for 8 days. Something shifted in his expression, not quite anger, something more controlled than anger. I am not going to stand here and wait for him to dismantle my life piece by piece while you blame yourself for it. Caleb. He killed my wife, Caleb said. It came out quiet, not dramatic, just a fact placed on the table. Not with his hands, with a decision about cargo space and profit margins that he made from an office in Philadelphia without ever knowing Eleanor's name. And now he's here in my town on my property using legal paper as a weapon. He paused. I don't need your permission to be angry about that. I just need you to trust me. Grace looked at him for a long moment. The part of her that had spent 8 months watching every action of every person for signs of self-interest searched his face for it and didn't find it. What she found instead was grief wearing the clothes of resolve, and under that something that had started, she realized, to look a great deal like something else. I trust you, she said. He held her gaze for one moment that had a weight to it she felt in her spine. Then he went to saddle his horse. He was gone 40 minutes. Grace spent them working with Midnight, not because she was calm, but because movement kept her from thinking in circles, and the horse responded to her state with the mirroring attention he'd developed. When she was tense, he was watchful. When she settled, he settled. They were in conversation without words, which was the only kind she could manage that hour. Caleb came back with Mason's refusal to act on the lien until the federal inquiry was resolved. He came back with something else, too. A name. Someone at the bank had overheard Victor talking before Caleb arrived, and the name they'd heard was one that made Deacons who Caleb had stopped to see on the way back go very quiet. Judge Hartley, Caleb said, standing at the fence with the name between them like something that needed to be handled carefully. Albright is requesting an emergency hearing before Judge Hartley, tomorrow morning, to compel your return under the terms of the contract. Grace felt the ground shift. Hartley is the circuit judge for this district, and he is also, according to Roy Deakins, a man who has a significant investment portfolio that happens to include several ventures associated with the Southern Arizona Railroad Consortium. Caleb looked at her. He's not neutral. The full weight of what that meant settled over Grace like the heat, not sudden, but total. Victor had outmaneuvered her, not on the facts, on the venue. With a compromised judge issuing an emergency order, the federal inquiry became temporarily irrelevant. Whatever Deakins could do wouldn't move fast enough. He's going to get his hearing, she said. Tomorrow at 9, Caleb said. Deakins can't block it. Hartley has the authority. Grace sat down on the fence rail, not because she was giving up, because she needed to think, and she thought better with her feet off the ground. What happens if I don't appear? Hartley issues a warrant for your detention pending the hearing, Caleb said, which gives Albright exactly what he wants and makes Deakins' hands completely tied. So I have to appear. Yes. And at the hearing with a compromised judge Victor's contract holds. Probably, Caleb said. Unless... He stopped. Grace looked up. Unless what? Caleb was doing the still thing again. The concentrated stillness. His eyes had the look of a man moving pieces on an internal board. Unless the hearing becomes about something larger than your contract, he said slowly. The judge can rule on the contract. He can't rule on a federal investigation. If the hearing room has witnesses who can speak to what you know, if the information you have gets spoken out loud in front of people, the judge can't instruct to forget it. He paused. He can rule in Albright's favor and still walk out of that room with Albright's entire operation exposed. The contract might hold, but Victor Albright won't be able to enforce it. Not if his business dealings are public record. Grace understood what he was proposing. "You want me to make the hearing a disclosure," she said. "I want you to decide if that's what you want," Caleb said. "It's not without risk. Hartley can find you in contempt, and Albright will know exactly what you've done." "He already knows what I've done," Grace said. "He's known since Deacons came to see him." She looked at the road at the direction Albright's buggy had gone at the dry, flat distance that separated Dry Mercy from everything else. "What do I need?" "Witnesses," Caleb said. "People who've seen or heard something, not rumors. Things they'd testify to." Grace thought of the Harlan boy's uncle on the bank floor who'd seen Victor come in. She thought of the stagecoach driver who'd overheard Victor on the road west and whom she'd traded 2 sentences with at the Tucson station. She thought of the hotel clerk in Tucson who'd been listening at every door for 6 months because hotel clerks always were. She thought of Martha Bell, who had been watching everything since the first morning and had the particular authority of a woman who had been in this town long enough that her word was not questioned. "I need to visit some people this afternoon," she said. "I'll come with you," Caleb said. "No," Grace said. "You'll stay here, and you'll trust me." He looked at her the way she'd looked at him an hour ago, searching for something, deciding about something. Then the corner of his mouth moved in the particular way it moved when he was conceding a point he hadn't expected to concede. "All right," he said. She was gone for 3 hours. She came back in the low gold light of the late afternoon with promises from 4 people. Martha Bell, Jim Harlan Sr., from the bank. A woman named Dolores, who ran the hotel laundry and had been present for a conversation between Victor and an unknown man about insurance valuations, and the Dry Mercy general store owner, who had extended Victor a line of credit and had been shown a consortium financial statement that Dolores now said didn't match the numbers Grace had on that card. Not ironclad, not a federal case, but 4 voices in a hearing room in front of witnesses speaking specific things they had specifically seen and heard. She came through the corral gate and told Caleb, and he listened to the whole list, and when she finished he said, "That's enough." "Is it?" she said. "To blow the roof off his operation in public?" "Yes." He looked at her. "To make the judge's ruling irrelevant in the eyes of the town and anyone who hears about it afterward?" "Yes." A pause. "To guarantee your safety afterward, I don't know. That part depends on him." Grace nodded. She already knew that. She'd known it when she'd asked the first person, because asking was the commitment, and there was no walking it back. "I'm afraid," she said. It came out simply, without drama, the way true things do when you've stopped performing them. Caleb looked at her. He stood 3 feet away with his hands at his sides and his face open in the way it almost never was, and he said, "I know. So am I." She looked up at him. "What are you afraid of?" He was quiet for a moment. Midnight was at the fence behind them in the last of the day's light, and the sound of the town had quieted down to the distant percussion of ordinary life. "That it goes wrong tomorrow," Caleb said, "and I have to watch someone else He stopped. He recalibrated. "That I don't do enough. That it isn't enough." It was not the most finished sentence she'd ever heard. It was the most honest. The stopped word sat between them, not quite spoken, not quite unsaid, and Grace felt it with the specific recognition of someone who had been listening for something and just heard it. "It'll be enough," she said. She meant it to steady him, but she looked at him when she said it, and the steadiness moved in both directions. "Tomorrow at 9, Caleb said. He held her gaze for 1 beat more than necessary, and then he looked away, the way you look away from something too bright in your direct line of sight. "Tomorrow at 9, Grace said. She walked back to the tack room. She did not sleep. Grace was dressed and standing at the corral gate when Caleb came out of his house at 7:30. He stopped when he saw her. She had borrowed a clean white blouse from Martha the evening before, returned pressed and folded to the boarding house porch before breakfast with a note that said simply "for tomorrow," and she had her hair pinned back with the kind of deliberate precision that communicated she had made a decision about how she was going to walk into that room. Not a runaway, not a confused woman suffering from episodes. A witness with a memory like a ledger and nothing left to lose by using it. Caleb looked at her for a moment. "You eat," he said. "Not yet." He went back inside and came out 2 minutes later with 2 biscuits wrapped in a cloth and handed them to her without comment. She ate one standing at the gate and gave him the other, which he accepted with the same silence, and they stood together at the edge of his property in the early morning cool with the town beginning to wake at the far end of the road. And neither of them said what they were both thinking. What they were both thinking was that in 90 minutes everything would be different one way or another, and there was nothing to do about that except show up. "You remember everything you're going to say?" Caleb asked. "I don't have a speech," Grace said. "I have facts. Facts don't require memorizing." He looked at her sideways. The corner of his mouth moved. "No," he said. "I reckon they don't." They walked to town together, not side by side exactly. Grace set the pace and Caleb matched it, which was different from leading, and she noticed the difference. He was doing what she'd shown him with Midnight, not reaching, walking alongside and letting her decide what it meant. The hearing was in the back room of the Dry Mercy Land Office, which was the largest indoor space in town that wasn't the saloon, and therefore the default venue for any official proceeding requiring more than 4 chairs. By the time Grace and Caleb arrived at 8:45, there were already more people present than the proceeding required. Martha Bell was there seated in the second row with the specific posture of a woman who had made up her mind. Jim Harlan Sr. sat beside her, hat on his knee. Dolores from the hotel laundry was in the back corner, small and quiet, with her hands folded. The general store owner, Patterson, stood against the side wall with the expression of a man deeply uncomfortable with his own decision to be present and committed to it anyway. Sheriff Deacon stood near the front to the side, not seated, which communicated his position precisely. He was there as law, not as participant, but he was there. And at the front table, already seated, already composed, was Victor Albright. He was back to polished. Whatever the last week had cost him in visible agitation, he had recovered it overnight. He sat with the contract on the table in front of him, and his 2 men positioned behind him, and the expression of a man who has run this calculation and found the outcome satisfactory. He looked at Grace when she came in, and the look said, "I knew you'd come. You always had to come." She looked back and said nothing. Judge Hartley was already seated at the head of the room. He was in his 60s, gray, with the permanently compressed expression of a man who had made too many decisions for too many years and had long since stopped examining whether they were the right ones. He looked at Grace when she came in, and then looked at his papers, which told her everything she needed to know about how he had already decided this would go. "This is an emergency hearing," Hartley said without preamble when the room had settled, "on the matter of a civil contract dispute between Mr. Victor Albright and Miss Grace Whitaker, formerly of Tucson. Mr. Albright has presented a valid contract signed by Edmund Whitaker of Tucson, Arizona Territory, assigning the care and legal guardianship of Grace Whitaker to Mr. Albright in exchange for the satisfaction of debts totaling—" "I am not property assigned to anyone's care," Grace said. The room went still. Hartley looked up from his papers. "Miss Whitaker, you will have an opportunity to— I want to make certain the record reflects from the beginning that I am a 24-year-old woman addressing a contract I was not party to and did not sign," Grace said. Her voice was level. She had not raised it. "Whatever the contract says, my name is not on it. I am not a debt instrument." Victor leaned toward his own attorney. A man Grace hadn't seen before arrived from somewhere overnight and said something quiet. The attorney stood up. "Your Honor, the terms of the contract are clear and have been validated by—" "Sit down." Deacon said it from the wall, not loudly, but with the tone of a man who carries a badge and intends it to mean something. "Let her finish." Hartley looked at Deakins with the irritation of a man whose proceeding was not going the way he'd arranged it. "Sheriff, this is a civil—" "I'm aware of what it is," Deakins said. "I'm also aware that there are witnesses present with relevant testimony and that a fair proceeding hears them, unless there's a reason you'd prefer not to." The sentence landed exactly the way Deakins had intended it to, with the weight of everything unspoken about his investment portfolio and his consortium associations pressing it down from above. Hartley said nothing for a moment. His jaw moved. "The witness may continue," he said. Grace looked at Victor. Victor looked back at her with the expression of a man who has started to suspect that the ground is not where he thought it was. "The contract my father signed was signed under duress," Grace said. "His debts to the Merchants Bank of Tucson were purchased by the Southern Arizona Railroad Consortium approximately 3 weeks before the contract was presented to him. He had no legal counsel present. He was told that failure to sign would result in immediate foreclosure proceedings that would leave him with nothing." She paused. "That is not a negotiation. That is coercion, and a contract signed under coercion is not enforceable." Victor's attorney was on his feet again. "That characterization is entirely—" "I'm not finished," Grace said. The attorney stopped. Something in her voice had the quality that midnight stillness had, not aggressive, but absolutely certain, the kind of certainty that was more unsettling than noise. "During the 8 months of my so-called engagement to Mr. Albright," Grace said, "I was present for several business discussions I was not intended to remember. I have a good memory. On the 14th of March, in the back room of the Continental Hotel in Tucson, Mr. Albright discussed land survey discrepancies with a man whose name I did not know at the time. The parcel numbers involved were 447-B523-A and 601-C. The assessed value on file with the Federal Land Office for those parcels is $42,000. The value discussed in that room was $11,000. The difference was to be managed through Thomas Birch's office. The room changed. Not loudly, not dramatically. It changed the way pressure changes when a door opens a shift in everything all at once. Grace heard someone behind her draw a breath. She didn't look away from Hartley. Hartley's face had gone the specific color of a man hearing his own name in a context he hadn't anticipated. He hadn't been named. But Thomas Birch had been named, and Thomas Birch and Judge Hartley had a relationship that apparently enough people in this room were aware of because the quality of the silence had changed from shock to recognition. Victor stood up. "Your Honor," he said, and for the first time since Grace had known him, the polished register had cracked. Not broken, cracked. A hairline fracture running through the certainty. "This woman is reciting fabrications from a stolen document, and I move that this testimony be—" "The card was given to me," Grace said, still not raising her voice. "And the testimony I am giving is from my own memory, not from any document. You cannot suppress a memory, Mr. Albright. You can only wish you'd had fewer conversations in rooms with bad doors." Someone in the back of the room made a sound that was almost a laugh and caught it. Victor turned to look at the room for the first time, and Grace watched him see what she'd seen when she walked in. Martha Bell, straight-backed and deliberate. Jim Harlan Sr. with his hat on his knee. Dolores with her folded hands. Patterson against the wall. The faces of people who had been quiet and waiting, and who were no longer going to be. "I would like to hear from the witnesses present," Deacon said from the wall. Hartley was silent for a long moment. The calculation was visible slower and more desperate than usual, a man trying to find the position that cost him least. Whatever he'd expected from this morning, it was not this room and these people and this woman standing at the front, with her hands steady and her voice level, naming numbers from a hotel conversation in March. "The witnesses may speak," Hartley said. His voice had gone flat. Martha Bell stood up without waiting to be called. "My name is Martha Bell," she said, "and I have operated a boarding house in this town for 11 years. On the morning of July 19th, Victor Albright came to my establishment and told me that Grace Whitaker was mentally confused and prone to fabrication." She paused. "I want to state for this record that in my 11 years in Dry Mercy, I have met every variety of confused person, and I know what confusion looks like. What I saw in Grace Whitaker was not confusion. It was a woman telling the truth about something that frightened her." She sat down. Jim Harlan Sr. stood. On the morning of July 22nd, Victor Albright entered Mason's bank and presented a lien instrument against Caleb Mercer's supply contracts. He represented himself as acting on behalf of the consortium and suggested that any bank refusing to honor the instrument would face difficulty in future consortium dealings. He paused. I work in that bank. I heard it. I wrote it down that afternoon because it struck me as the kind of thing a person should have written down. He sat. Dolores stood. Her voice was soft, and she spoke quickly, as if she might lose her nerve if she slowed down. In the hotel laundry, I hear conversations from rooms above. I do not go looking for them. On March 9th, I heard Mr. Albright say to a man whose voice I didn't know that the survey numbers for the parcels going to the federal office needed to go through Birch before the end of the month, and that Birch had been paid and would not be a problem. She sat down very quickly. Patterson was last. He cleared his throat. Albright showed me a consortium financial statement when he was arranging credit here. The operating revenue number on that statement does not match the number Miss Whitaker just said those parcels were assessed at. Somebody's arithmetic is wrong. He paused. It ain't mine. The room sat in the aftermath of 4 voices, and Victor Albright stood at the front with his polished exterior, and his attorney, and his contract, and for the first time, Grace could see the shape of what he actually was. Underneath all of it, a man who had built everything on the assumption that the people around him didn't matter enough to be listened to and had been wrong. Hartley looked at his papers. He looked at Victor. He looked at the room. This proceeding, he said very carefully, is adjourned pending review of the contract terms and the matters raised in testimony. He stood. All testimony given today will be provided to the Federal Land Office for their review in connection with ongoing inquiry. Victor's attorney was immediately on his feet. Your Honor, the contract matter has not been... It's been adjourned, Hartley said, and walked out of the room. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Victor turned to look at Grace, and the hairline fracture in his composure had become something larger and less controlled. He crossed the room toward her in 4 steps, and Caleb moved, not rushing, not dramatic, just stepped directly into the space between them, with the complete, unhurried certainty of a man who had decided exactly where he was standing. I wouldn't, Caleb said, quietly. The way you say something to someone who you genuinely do not want to have to repeat yourself to. Victor stopped. He looked at Caleb. He looked at Deakins, who had moved from the wall to a position 3 feet away, with his hand resting on his belt in the particular casual way that wasn't casual at all. This isn't over, Victor said. No, Grace said from behind Caleb's shoulder. But it's over for today, and today was the day that mattered. Victor looked at her one last long look, the kind that was trying to find something to hold on to, some leverage, some angle that hadn't been closed off. He found nothing. She watched him understand that, and she watched him make the decision to leave rather than compound it, which was the first intelligent decision she'd seen him make in 8 months. He walked out. His attorney followed. His 2 men who had been standing uselessly near the wall for the past 20 minutes trailed after. The room exhaled. Martha Bell appeared at Grace's elbow with the specific efficiency of a woman who moves toward resolution the way water moves downhill. You did well, she said. It was not a compliment given lightly. Grace received it the same way. Deakins came to stand beside Caleb. Federal office will have a full report by end of week, he said. Birch is going to have a hard time explaining those numbers when they come from 4 independent sources. He paused. The contract is still technically valid until a court reviews the coercion claim. That could take time. How much time? Caleb said. Weeks, maybe longer. Deakins looked at Grace. You're not free of it yet, but you're not his either. Not today. Today is what I had, Grace said. Deakins nodded. He put his hat on and walked out. The room emptied slowly. Martha with a squeeze of Grace's arm. Patterson with a nod that carried more than a nod usually did. Dolores slipping out the side door with the quiet speed of someone who had been braver than they expected to be, and needed a moment alone with that. Jim Harlan Sr. stopped at the door. He turned back and looked at Grace. My boy came to Mercer's Corral 3 nights ago, he said. To warn you. He paused. I told him to. I want you to know that. He put his hat on and went out. Grace stood in the emptied room with Caleb beside her, and the sound of the town resuming its ordinary day coming in from outside, and she felt something shift in her chest, Not relief, not quite. Something quieter and more foundational. The particular sensation of ground that holds when you put your weight on it. "It's not done," she said. "No," Caleb said. "He'll file again, through a different channel." "Probably. The federal inquiry could take months, and until it resolves I'm still technically Grace," Caleb said. She stopped. "You just walked into a room with a compromised judge and a man who had every legal instrument pointed at you," he said, "and you made 4 people stand up in public and speak the truth because you asked them to." He looked at her directly the way he looked at things he'd decided about. "Whatever comes next, you didn't run from it. You walked straight into the middle of it, and you made it answer you." He paused. "That changes things, not legally, but in ways that matter more than legal." Grace looked at him. The morning light was coming through the land office window at a low angle, and it caught the side of his face, and she thought about Eleanor, who had been 29, and about the 3 years Caleb had spent building walls, and about what it meant that she could see his face this clearly. "I need to check on Midnight," she said, because it was the most honest thing she could think to say about what she needed, which was to be somewhere that was entirely real and entirely her own. "He'll be fine," Caleb said. "He's had your grain and your company for 2 weeks. He's not going anywhere." "I know," Grace said, "but I want to see him." Caleb held the door open. She walked through it and out into the July morning, and he came after her, and they walked back up the main road together through a town that watched them pass with an attention that had changed quality, not the calculation of before, not the waiting to see. Something that was beginning to look, Martha Bell would say later, like respect. Halfway up the road, Grace said, "Thank you." "For what specifically?" Caleb said. "For stepping in front of him." Caleb was quiet for a few steps. "I told you," he said. "That wasn't for you." "I know what you told me," Grace said. He looked over at her. "You stepped in front of him," she said, "and your hand wasn't on your gun. You weren't protecting yourself. You stepped between him and me, and you just stood there." She kept her eyes on the road. "That's not a man defending a principle. That's something else." Caleb said nothing for long enough that she wondered if she'd said too much. Then he said, "You're not wrong." They walked the rest of the way in a silence that had something in it neither of them named yet, something that needed more time and steadier ground. But that was there unmistakably, the way dawn is there before the light actually breaks. At the corral gate, Midnight was at the fence watching them come. He put his nose over the top rail when Grace reached him, and she put her hand against his face, and he leaned into it with the full trusting weight of an animal that had decided past all previous evidence to the contrary that this particular person was worth it. Caleb stood beside her at the fence and watched them. "I've been thinking," he said after a moment, "about the sign." Grace looked up. "The for sale sign on the house," he said. "Been up 3 years. Doesn't mean what it meant when I put it there." He looked straight ahead at the paddock, the horses, the flat Arizona distance. "I think it's time it came down." Grace looked at the side of his face. At the jaw she'd learned to read at the hands that were open and loose at his sides. "Yeah," she said. "I think it probably is. He pushed off the fence and walked toward the house, and she watched him pull the sign from the post with both hands. It came out of the sun-hardened ground with a sound like something releasing, and he didn't throw it. He just set it against the fence, flat, the painted letters facing down. He turned around. Across the corral yard, Grace Whitaker was watching him, with her hand still resting on Midnight's face, and the horse was still, and the morning was still, and Caleb Mercer stood in the middle of his property in the full July heat, and let himself be seen. It was the hardest thing he'd done in 3 years. It was also the most right. The for sale sign stayed face down against the fence for 3 days before anyone in town mentioned it. Martha Bell was the one who mentioned it because Martha Bell was the one who mentioned everything that mattered in Dry Mercy before anyone else worked up the nerve. She said it to Grace directly on the morning after the hearing, while Grace was picking up a sack of oats from Patterson's store, and Martha happened to be standing at the counter with the specific quality of presence that meant she had not happened to be standing there at all. "People are talking about that sign," Martha said. "People talk about everything," Grace said. "They're talking about it favorably," Martha said, which was her way of saying the town has made its decision, and I want you to know what it is. Grace paid for the oats and carried them out without responding, but she held that piece of information carefully the whole way back to the corral, the way you hold something fragile that you're not ready to put down yet. The days after the hearing moved differently than the days before it. The pressure that had lived under everything, in every sound from the road, every unfamiliar horse outside the fence, every morning that began with the question of whether this was the day, Victor found a new angle had not vanished, but it had changed character. It was waiting pressure now rather than incoming pressure, and waiting she could manage. Victor had gone back to Tucson. Deakins confirmed it on the second day with the specific neutral tone of a man reporting a fact while communicating considerably more. "He'll be back," Deakins said. "But not until the federal inquiry shakes out, because showing up here while that's active makes him look like exactly what he is." He paused. "You bought yourself time, Miss Whitaker. Use it." She used it. She used it the way she'd been using every day at the corral completely, with both hands leaving nothing in reserve. The work had become hers in a way she hadn't expected and couldn't have predicted when she'd climbed over that fence in a ruined wedding dress. It had started as survival and become something else entirely, a rhythm. She fit inside of a set of relationships with the horses, with the land, with the particular demands of a working operation that required her specific knowledge and her specific patience and gave her back the sensation of being genuinely necessary. That was the thing Victor had never understood about her. He had wanted her obedience and her inheritance and her social function, and he had looked at her and seen exactly those things and nothing beyond them. He had never once asked what she was actually good at. She was good at this. Midnight confirmed it on the morning of the fourth day after the hearing in a way that stopped Caleb dead in the middle of repairing a gate latch and made him stand with the latch in one hand, watching with an expression he didn't try to manage. Grace had saddled him. Not fully, no bit, just a hackamore, and the saddle placed with the slow, deliberate patience of something offered rather than imposed, and Midnight had stood for all of it. And then she had put her foot in the stirrup and swung up, and the black stallion that had broken 3 men's bones and destroyed sections of fence and screamed at the Arizona sky for 4 months stood completely, absolutely still. Then he walked forward, not because she'd cued him, because he chose to. Caleb said nothing for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice had the specific quality it got when something moved him past his usual register. 4 months, he said. I spent 4 months. You were trying to take something, Grace said from Midnight's back. You can't take trust. You can only wait for it to be given. Caleb looked at her. You keep teaching me things, he said, and making it sound simple. It is simple, Grace said. It's just not easy. He held her gaze for a moment, and then he smiled. Actually smiled. Not the corner of the mouth thing she'd cataloged and learned, but the full version, the one she suspected very few people had seen in the past 3 years. And it changed his face entirely. And Grace made herself look away before she did something she hadn't decided to do yet. She rode Midnight in a slow circle around the round pen instead, and concentrated on the horse. The letter from the federal land office arrived on the 12th day. Deakins brought it himself, which told her it was significant before she'd read a word of it. He came to the corral in the mid-morning and handed it to Caleb, who read it and handed it to Grace without speaking, and Grace read it twice to make certain she was reading it correctly. Thomas Birch had surrendered his position and cooperated with the federal inquiry in exchange for a reduced penalty. His cooperation had produced documentation confirming that 4 land parcels in the Southern Arizona Railroad Consortium's acquisition portfolio had been fraudulently assessed. The discrepancy in valuations totaled over $60,000. An arrest warrant had been issued in Tucson for Victor Albright on charges of land fraud conspiracy and filing false instruments with the federal land office. He had not been at his office when the warrant was served. He had not been at his residence. Victor Albright had as of 3 days ago left Tucson on a westbound train and had not been located. Grace read that last part a third time. He ran, she said. He ran. Deakins confirmed. She sat down on the fence rail. Not because her legs gave out, because she needed a moment to let the shape of this settle. For 8 months, Victor Albright had been the fixed point around which everything else moved her decisions. Her fear, her father's choices, the legal weight pressing down on everything. He had seemed immovable, permanent, the kind of problem that doesn't resolve, only changes form. And he had run, not from her specifically. From consequences. From the accumulated weight of the truth she'd handed to Deacons in a back kitchen over water and cornbread, the truth that 4 people had stood up and spoken in a land office hearing room, the truth that didn't go away when you left town, because it was already in writing and in testimony and in the federal record. The contract, Grace said, with my father. A contract made under coercion by a man now facing federal fraud charges, Deacons said, is not a contract any territorial judge is going to enforce. Especially not now. He paused. I'd call that resolved, Miss Whitaker. Informally, but resolved. She looked at Caleb. He was watching her with that open expression, the one he'd been allowing more frequently since the hearing, the one that cost him something, and that he was apparently deciding the cost was worth. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. She could read him now the way she'd learned to read midnight, not through words, but through the quality of his stillness, through where he directed his attention, through the specific way a person holds themselves when they are entirely present with you. My father, Grace said quietly, not to either of them, to herself mostly. She had not let herself think about her father directly since the morning she'd run. It had been necessary not to. He lived in a part of her that she'd closed off the way you close a room you're not ready to go back into. But Edmund Whitaker was still in Tucson, still in debt, still the man who had handed his daughter to a stranger to settle a ledger, and that was a fact that didn't resolve just because Victor had run. I need to write him a letter, she said. Neither Caleb nor Deacon said anything, which was the correct response. Not to forgive him, she said. I'm not there yet, but he needs to know the inquiry is resolved and the contract is void because someone has to tell him, and it should be me. She paused. He's still my father. That's separate from what he did. Caleb nodded. One single nod that contained no judgment whatsoever. Deacons put his hat on. I'll leave you both to it, he said, and went back to town with the particular tact of a man who has delivered his news and understands when his presence has become unnecessary. Grace wrote the letter that afternoon. It took 4 drafts. The first 3 were wrong. Too angry, then too forgiving, then too formal, which was a kind of dishonesty of its own. The 4th one was just true. Short, specific, and true. She told him the contract was void. She told him what Victor had been, what Victor had done, and where Victor had gone. She told him she was safe, and that she had found work, and that she was not coming back to Tucson. She told him she would write again when she had something more to say, and that she didn't know when that would be. She gave it to the outgoing mail at the general store, and walked back to the corral and didn't think about his face when he read it, because she couldn't afford to yet, and she was getting better at knowing what she could afford. What she hadn't expected was what happened the following Sunday. Dry Mercy had a small church at the north end of town, white-painted practical, run by a preacher named Abel, who was respected primarily because he kept his sermons under 20 minutes. Grace had not attended. She'd been aware of the town's awareness of her non-attendance, the way you're aware of anything that other people are tracking, but she hadn't been ready to walk into a building full of people whose opinions of her were still settling. On Sunday morning of the 3rd week, Martha Bell appeared at the corral gate. "You're coming to church," she said. "I'm not sure You're coming," Martha said. "Not because God requires it. Because this town has made its decision about you, and it's the right decision, and you need to be there to receive it properly." She looked at Caleb, who was standing inside the corral, pretending to inspect a harness with entirely too much focus. "Both of you." Caleb put the harness down. They walked to church together. The 3 of them. Martha slightly ahead because that was how Martha moved through the world, and Grace and Caleb side by side, in the same configuration they'd developed on the road, Grace setting the pace, Caleb matching it. The church was full. Grace felt the shift in the room when she came through the door, heads turning, the adjustment of a space accommodating someone new to it. She had been prepared for the complicated middle ground of provisional acceptance, which was the most she'd thought she had a right to expect. What she got was different. Jim Harlan Sr. stood up when she came in. Just stood up, not dramatically, not performing it, just got to his feet and nodded. And then the woman beside him stood. And then Patterson from the general store. And then 3 or 4 others, and then more. The way these things move through a room when the first person has done the hard part and made it possible for everyone else. Grace stopped walking. It was not applause. It was not a speech. It was people standing up in a small church in the Arizona territory on a Sunday morning in July to say with their bodies the thing that was apparently easier to do with your body than your mouth. We were wrong to look away, and we are not looking away now. Martha Bell, who had moved to her usual pew, sat down without looking at Grace, which meant she was trying not to show that she was moved, which meant she was moved. Grace stood at the back of that church and felt something break open in her chest that she had not known was sealed, and she breathed through it without looking away from the people who were standing. And then she walked to a pew and sat down, and Caleb sat beside her, and Preacher Abel, who had seen everything and understood the room entirely, opened his Bible and said, "Let's begin." The sermon was 17 minutes. It was about the difference between mercy and permission. Grace thought it might be the best thing she'd heard in a year. Afterward, outside, it was Dolores who reached her first small, quick, the same hands that had been folded in the land office hearing room, now reaching out to take both of Grace's and hold them. "You were braver than I was," Dolores said. "You asked me to stand up and I did, but you were the one who made me able to." "You were brave," Grace said. "I just asked." "That's the whole of it, though, isn't it?" Dolores said. "Somebody has to ask." She let go and went to find her family, and Grace stood in the July morning outside a church she'd never entered before 3 weeks ago, in a town she'd arrived at by accident, in a life that looked nothing like the life that had been planned for her, and she took inventory. She was alive. She was free. She had work she was good at, and a horse that trusted her, and 4 people who had stood up in a legal proceeding because she'd asked them to, and they had found themselves capable of more than they'd known. She had Caleb Mercer standing 6 feet away, talking to Preacher Abel about a fence repair, laughing at something Abel said, actually laughing the full version again, the one she suspected she was the only person outside of Eleanor who'd seen more than once, not hers. She wasn't using that word. But there, which was enough for now. Genuinely, solidly by his own choosing there. A week later, a letter came from her father. It was short. Edmund Whitaker was not a man accustomed to apology, and the letter showed it. He got close to the word twice and moved away from it both times, circling the thing without landing. But underneath the circling, the bones of it were there. He had not known the full extent of Victor's fraud. He had not known what the contract meant in practice. He had told himself he was securing her future when he had been in truth securing his own relief from a problem he couldn't solve, and there was no framing of that which came out well. He had sold a parcel of land and paid the remaining debts himself, which had apparently required the sale of nearly everything else he had. He was living in 2 rooms above a Tucson hardware store. He was well. He asked if she was. Grace read the letter 3 times. Then she sat down and wrote back, "Yes, I am." She added 2 sentences about dry mercy, 1 sentence about the horse operation, and 1 sentence that said she would write more when she had more. She sealed it and gave it to the mail, and she felt the room she'd been keeping closed shift slightly on its hinges, not open, but no longer sealed. Some things needed time. She was getting better at giving them time. The change in Caleb happened quietly. The way all the real things between them happened. Not announced, not performed, just suddenly visible as a completed fact. It was a Tuesday. Not a significant Tuesday. Grace was in the round pen running midnight through a series of turns that she'd been developing over 3 weeks, not breaking nothing. Like breaking more, like a conversation conducted at speed. The horse responding to shifts in her weight with an accuracy that still caught her off guard sometimes. She was entirely inside it, the way you get entirely inside things that require your whole attention when midnight stopped. Not because she'd asked him to, because he'd heard something. She looked up. Caleb was standing at the round pen fence. He'd been there long enough that midnight had noticed him, which meant several minutes at least. He was just watching. His arms were on the top rail and his hat was pushed back and his face had the open expression, and in it was something that wasn't new, but that he'd stopped trying to keep below the surface. "What?" Grace said. "Nothing," Caleb said. "Just watching." "You've been watching for 10 minutes. "I have," he agreed. She walked midnight toward the fence and stopped a few feet out and looked at Caleb directly the way she'd learned to do with him, straight on, no angling, because angling with Caleb was a waste of both their time. "Say what you're thinking," she said. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at his hands on the rail. Then he looked back up. "Eleanor used to say that the hardest thing about grief wasn't the missing," he said. "It was the guilt of the days when you didn't miss. When you were too busy, or too tired, or too present in what was happening to be absent in the old way." He paused. "She was talking about her own mother who died the year before we married. But I've been thinking about it differently lately." Grace waited. "I've been having days," he said, "where I'm not absent." He met her eyes. "More of them recently." The July heat pressed down around them. Midnight stood between her and the fence patient, warm, absolutely still. "That's not guilt," Grace said. "That's living." "I know," Caleb said. "I'm learning the difference." A pause. "You're a significant part of why I'm learning it." She looked at him. At the hands she'd watched repair fence and gentle horses, and hand her coffee without requiring thanks. At the face she'd learned to read over 3 weeks of small things that were not small things. At the man who had stepped between her and Victor Albright, with his hands open and his feet planted, and nothing behind him but the decision to stand there. "Caleb," she said. "I'm not asking you to decide anything," he said quickly. "I know the ground here is still, I know things are still resolving. I just wanted to say it honestly because I've spent 3 years not saying honest things and I'm tired of it." He paused. "You deserve to know where you stand with the people around you. You didn't have that for a long time. I didn't want to be another person keeping that from you." Grace dismounted. She handed Midnight's lead to the fence post and walked to the gate and opened it and stood in front of Caleb Mercer on solid ground. "I'm not deciding anything either," she said. "But I want you to know the days when I'm present here, they're not small. What's here is not small to me." She paused. "I ran from a man who wanted to own me, and I walked into your corral, and something in me recognized something in this place that I hadn't had in a very long time." She looked at him. "I think that was you, not just the corral." Caleb was very still. "I think," she said, "that we're both learning the same thing at approximately the same time, which seems like as good a place as any to start." He reached out and took her hand. Not dramatically, not with declaration, just took it, the way you take hold of something you've decided is worth holding, and she let him. And they stood at the gate of the round pen in the full August heat that had replaced July with midnight, watching them from the fence with the calm attention of an animal that understood entirely what was happening and found it entirely correct. Months later, when people asked Grace Whitaker how she had come to Dry Mercy, she told them the same thing every time. She said, "I was running from someone who believed he owned me, and I walked into a pen with a horse that everyone said was dangerous, and neither of us was what we looked like from the outside." She said the horse taught me how to stay. The man learned alongside me. She said I stopped running the day I realized that the thing I'd been running toward had been standing still this whole time, waiting for me to arrive. Caleb Mercer's corral became in the years that followed known for 2 things across the Arizona territory. The first was the horses, specifically the difficult ones, the ones other operations had given up on, the ones that arrived already broken by the wrong kind of hands and left steady and willing after weeks of patience. The second was the woman who worked them, who had chestnut hair and a voice that could quiet a frightened animal in under a minute, and a particular way of standing in an open space that made everything around her go still. Grace never became the runaway bride again. That version of her had dissolved somewhere on the desert road between Tucson and Dry Mercy, in the long walk that had carried her out of one life and into the one she was supposed to be living. Victor Albright was located 4 months later in California, tried in federal court, and convicted on 11 counts of land fraud. Thomas Birch served 2 years. Edmund Whitaker rebuilt slowly, and the letters between father and daughter became over time something that resembled honesty, imperfect, careful real. And Caleb Mercer, who had spent 3 years behind walls of his own building, came out of them entirely. Not because grief left him, because grief doesn't leave, but because he learned at the side of a woman who had run across the desert in a wedding dress and walked into the most dangerous pen in town without flinching. That the opposite of grief is not the absence of pain. The opposite of grief is the decision to be present anyway. That was what Grace had given him. Not rescue, she had not rescued him, and she would have refused the role if it had been offered. What she had given him was demonstration. A living example of what it looked like to walk straight toward the thing that frightened you, and offer it your open hand, and wait. He had been watching her do it since July 14th. He had finally learned how, and on a Tuesday morning in October, in the round pen at the edge of Dry Mercy, Arizona, with midnight standing quietly between them and the whole flat, beautiful distance of the territory, opening up in every direction. Caleb Mercer looked at Grace Whitaker and said simply, the thing he had been carrying since the morning she walked out of his round pen in a ruined dress and held her back straight under the stares of an entire town. I want you to stay. Not because I need someone here, because I choose you. If you'll choose me back. Grace Whitaker looked at the man in front of her, the open hands, the honest face, the 3 years of hard-earned quiet that had finally broken into something warmer, and she made the only decision that had ever in her entire life felt entirely her own. I already have, she said, and that was the whole of it. 2 people who had learned the hard way, and then the right way, that love is not a contract freedom, is not a destination, and home is not a place you're assigned to. Home is where you plant your feet, open your hands, and choose to stay.